I'm just going to talk finally about the latest attack on Britain and her previous empire, which has come from a magazine called The Print. This was published today, and I saw it this morning, and I was like, right, okay, I want to talk about this. This has been something I've wanted to talk about for a while. This kind of continual demonization of the British Empire, and it's interesting how it's done. So this is an excerpt from a book called Time's Monster by Priya Satia, who I'm guessing is from India, and it's interesting in as a reflection of like Priti Patel on the other side, supporting the British conservative view of the world. This again comes from the opposite side, and just show that it's not about race. It's not about one race or another. It's not. It's way more complicated than that. The British Empire was a vast and in some ways incorporative project, but in other ways there are complaints about it that do resonate with me. Just to sidetrack myself very quickly, I listened to Afua Hirsch. She did a podcast series on audible.com called We Need to Talk About the British Empire, and in one of them, her and the person she was interviewing were complaining that the British Empire effectively created open borders for their countries, but not for Britain. And so one of the reasons that they want open borders for Britain is essentially so we can know what it feels like. And I am actually sympathetic to that, because I do disagree with the idea of open borders. And I do think that it does do damage to the populations unto which have to suffer it. So I'm not unsympathetic to the argument that that is something that happened. There are obviously, upsides and downsides to that. There are opportunities presented that would otherwise not have been presented. Things change. But anyway, I love the way that this is framed. Priya Satia says, countless anti-colonial thinkers and historians have proven the British Empire's morally bankrupt foundation in racism, violence, extraction, expropriation, and exploitation. Okay, let's stop there. That's like her opening gambit. Compared to what? And as soon as you asked, was it Sol's second question, then suddenly you realise, well, hang on. We're comparing it to what? The Arab slavers? Or the African slavers, or the Mughal Empire in India, a Turkic Mongol warlord conquers an empire in India. He's the grandson, I think, of Tamer the Lame, and then imposes this vast bureaucratic empire in India, under which something like 65% of the people were peasant serfs, and they had to pay 50% taxes on whatever they'd earned. Like, it's not like the British Empire turned up in the Garden of Eden, kicked down the gates and was like, right, okay, you're all going to work for us now. Put down the fruit that you're plucking from the trees and get in the fields or something. It's not like this wasn't built on racism either, because it was an ethnic aristocracy and an ethnic conquest of India from non-Indians who imposed an Islamic regime on India, which previously was not an Islamic subcontinent. So the British did very little that was actually different in this regard to the previous conquerors of India. But really, all empires are rooted in conquest, which means violence, racism, extraction, and exploitation. That's what an empire is. It is the domination of an ethnic group over other ethnic groups. Not all of these empires have the same character and qualities and methods of governance or anything like that, and that's actually one of the things that distinguishes the British from other empires that we'll get to in a minute. But this isn't exactly a surprise, but even then, the attitude that it was just purely extractive is not really true. The British Empire wasn't really like the Spanish or Portuguese empires. In much more, it was a trading empire. I mean, Britain came to occupy India because of the expansion of the East India Company, which actually had a very small military force and gained its power through trade. But anyway, we'll get onto the major defences of the British Empire shortly. She says, according to a 2016 study, 43% of Britons believe the empire was a good thing, and 44% consider Britain's colonial past a source of pride. That's not high enough, is it? I'm joking. A 2020 study showed that Britons are more likely than people in France, Germany, Japan, and other former colonial powers to say that their country should still have an empire, or would like their country to still have an empire. So, okay, well, I mean, there are probably good reasons for that, right? Like, Germany and Japan were just openly genocidal terror states that were exercising power for the desire for power. But that wasn't really what the British that wasn't really what the British were doing with empire, because the empire wasn't directed by the state. The state was catching up to the expansion of British society. But anyway, the thing I find very interesting about this, though, is that the standard by which previous empires and Britain's empire itself is being judged are the standards that were invented by Britain itself. And so without the British Empire, why would we agree that these standards are good or necessary or just? I mean, you may well do it in an abstract way, but when it's on the ground, when you're dealing with the imperial power, whatever imperial power it was, any previous empire is not going to say, well, actually, maybe we should be concerned about the human rights of the people we've conquered. That's just not something that people thought about, because they didn't necessarily have the same kind of moral values that the British did. I mean, there is certainly an argument that the British Empire did spread concepts like liberty and human rights, and that the British were conscious of doing so as they were in the process of conquering their empire. So it's not that they did anything unusual when it comes to cruelty or malice or anything like that. What they did that was unusual and set the stage for this very criticism was the self-consciousness and the moral impetus that underpinned the empire. I mean, a lot of Christian activism is left out of the history of the empire, where missionaries would go to these places and try and help people. They would obviously try and convert them to Christianity, but in converting them to Christianity, they were trying to end customs that were just deeply harmful. Again, in India, one custom the British outlawed was the burning of a widow after her husband had died. Not very human rights conscious, is it? But that was just fine under the Mughals. Why didn't the Mughal Empire? They'd conquered into India. Why didn't they put an end to that practice? Why was it the British that put an end to that practice? Well, it's because the British came from a Western Enlightenment tradition of human rights, and they were very concerned about these things. They had a long history, in fact, in England of constitutional and human and the rights of Englishmen that gets externalized and universalized into human rights, into what we end up with today. In fact, the world we have today is very much a product of the British Empire. The things we value today are a product of English political thought that was spread around the world by Britain. And this is the very basis upon which Britain is being criticised for her empire. And I just want to be clear, I'm going to take a drink so my throat's getting a bit dry, but I just want to be clear. It's not like there weren't British people at the time who were not conscious of their own failings when it came to empire and the necessary things that they felt they had to do in order to maintain the empire. And again, compared to what? And we'll get to the compared to what in a minute, because Britain gets condemned for the compared to what as well. Not only did you not do this perfectly, but you allowed these other people to do things after you stopped doing what you were doing. And it's like, well, how can we win? How could we ever redeem ourselves? So one example of this is in Orwell's essay, which is Shooting an Elephant. And this is fantastic. Orwell wrote this when he was young, and he was stationed in India as a European in India, which was not, in his description, a very envious thing to be, because he would get booed and jeered by just Indians. They would recognize him as being white, and they would effectively be racist towards him. But there was a way that things were done in British India, in the Raj. And the Europeans, the Brits, were meant to act in a certain way in order to maintain this kind of facade that they were stoic men of invincible discipline, because this was admirable and was something that they felt allowed the native populations to at least justify their right to rule, rather than just having it being done on brute force, which is, again, an interesting aspect of British rule. They actually felt there should be some kind of moral impetus behind it, whereas the Mughal conquerors, they didn't have any kind of impetus behind it. They were just, we're stronger, which is very much the Central Asian tenet of leadership. But anyway, this is a quote from Shooting an Elephant, where he being like the governor of whatever town it is he's in, is told by one of the locals, well, there's an elephant, a domestic elephant that's gone nuts, and it's rampaging through the marketplace, it's destroying houses. You need to come and deal with it. And he's like, oh God, what am I going to do? So he gets his rifle and marches down. And as he's marching down, he hates it. He hates what he has to do, but he knows that he has to do it because there are loads of people watching, not just his fellow Brits watching him make, do what he should be done, take action and responsible leadership, and make sure no one's hurt by this elephant, because already one person has been killed by the elephant, and so the elephant needs to be put down and protect various other pieces of property, but also because the Indians themselves are following him. He ends up gathering like a crowd of like 2,000 Indians who normally would hate him, but now he's going to go and do something that's interesting, so it's kind of like a show. And he says, well, this would have happened in England as well, and it doubtless would have done. Like, why wouldn't you want to watch this happening? This would be an interesting thing to happen in your daily life. But this is the quote. As for the job I was doing, I hated it more bitterly than I can perhaps make clear. In a job like that, you see the dirty work of empire at close quarters, the wretched prisoners huddling in the stinking cages of the lockups, the grey, cowed faces of the long-term convicts, the scarred buttocks of men who had been bogged with bamboo. All of these oppressed me with an intolerable sense of guilt, but I could get nothing into perspective. I was young and ill-educated, and I had to think out my problems in the utter silence that is imposed on every Englishman in the East. The business of empire is never pleasant, but why, when it comes to the business of empire, should the British be judged differently to others? If they can be judged differently to others, by what standard are we judging them? And of course, this author has adopted the British standard by which to judge us. The very standard that Orwell was judging himself by, and yet felt confined and compelled by, or against, sorry, because of the nature of what an empire is. Anyway, she carries on. The balance sheet attempts to show the pros and cons of the empire, that the pros outweighed the cons. Pros like trains, dams, and the rule of law outweighed the cons, occasional violent excesses, racism, despite the... Sorry for the... What, every day? Despite the ambiguous impact of many alleged pros, the deeply flawed premise that we can judge an inherently illegitimate and immoral system by anything other than its illegitimacy and its immorality. Well, I mean, why would you... From what grounding are you claiming that empires are illegitimate? Because up until this point in history, in fact, right, the modern post-World War II consensus is that empires are bad. Up until that point, literally nobody thought that empires were bad. Nobody thought the concept of empire was going to go away. The main complaint was really, well, we should be in charge of the empire, not you. We don't want to be oppressed by you. And that's everyone's contention, obviously. But the very concept of empire wasn't really something people were complaining about. And the only place that really this had been settled, to my knowledge, was in Europe with Westphalia. The Treaty of Westphalia, which established the sovereignty of the nation-states of Europe. But even then, that didn't work. It's not like there weren't enough empires across the continent of Europe that violated these principles. So again, it's all being done retrospectively. Britain is being condemned retrospectively by the set of values it championed. And other empires, like, they didn't operate through the sort of Western Enlightenment view that Britain did. Like, it might be, in the case of the Mughals, if they're an Islamic empire, so it might be obedience to God. Or in China, it might be the will of the emperor. Or in Germany, it'd be the triumph of the race. Or, in the case of Britain, liberty and human rights and the rule of law. So, pick your poison, but one of these is going to have to be picked. And at the end of the day, I think that there are many people, presumably people like Priti Patel, who, again, were involved in the empire themselves, like, Indian families who were involved in this, who would have preferred that than the alternative. She says, historical analysis... Sorry, I'm going to have another drink. One of the things I find really interesting about this, though, after what I would describe as this one-sided attack on Britain and her empire, I mean, an inherently illegitimate and immoral system... seems to make it sound like this is total condemnation and nothing good came of this. Historical analysis, framed as the unmasking of hypocrisy, acquires a prosecutorial tone that vitiates understanding. Not all rationalizations are cynical and transparent. We have to take the ethical claims of historical actors seriously to understand how ordinary people acting in particular institutional and cultural frameworks can, despite good intentions, author appalling chapters of human history. Yeah, there's nothing prosecutorial about this. Like the idea is that, well, we don't want to unmask people as hypocrites, which they were. anyone like, I mean, this is what Orwell's guilt is founded on: the hypocrisy of having to be an oppressive force, and yet having to take part in this, and this going against his own deeply held liberal values. So yes, it is hypocritical, but yes, you are still being prosecutorial. I could go on, but I don't think I will, because we're kind of getting towards the end and I want to answer some questions. But basically, what she's arguing is that the British Empire is essentially as evil as Nazi Germany. And she does actually say things like this, that Britain essentially shouldn't be redeemed after its empire. But Britain's empire was not worse than others. It was not markedly significant in any other distinction than its concern for human rights and the liberalization of the world. So I don't see why we should be ashamed of that. I don't see why we should condemn it. And I think that this just comes from a kind of sense of my team lost and I'm upset about it. But really, I don't think her team did lose. I think that you've got modern India, where you've got, I believe they have common law. They definitely inherited many British institutions and preserved these. So at the end of the day, I don't see why you would be so resentful, why you would need to say, oh, this colonization. And if you're going to do that, why stop at Britain? Why not keep going? India's got a long history of empire and colonization. Keep going.